Greetings, welcome to Powered by Ancestry. I'm your host, Kwesi Kunadu. On this episode, we will focus on an enigmatic question. Where is the land of the ancestors, if there is one? How do you get there? And what does it look like? These questions are always there because there's no really way to answer them, or is it? So in this episode, I want to pursue those questions with you based on my experiences visiting as well as talking to people who inhabit that world. Let's get started with misconceptions. Many of us believe or think or are seduced into thinking that when we transition, that is when we pass away, or in common terms, when we die, which we'll come to a little bit later, we go to a place where we sleep eternally. Now, that mythology comes from Christian theology. And of course, Christian theology has its many issues, and that is just but one of them. In Islam, supposedly one, particularly a male, goes to some place where they're surrounded by dozens, if not more, virgins, and they live the good life. In other theologies, they have their own particular interpretation of what happens to us once we leave this human body and flesh and move on into a non-human, immaterial experience. So I want to demystify those. No, it is false that when we do transition, we do not go to sleep forever. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But first, let me give you some background. You see, my folks, the Akan peoples of Ghana, and of course my people from Benin, West Africa, they have certain ideas about what happens once we transition out of this world. Now, the question you may have in mind, well, how do I or how do they know this, right? In other words, the land of the ancestors, if it is a land at all, none of us have actually gone there and come back and said, this is really what it's like. And so how do we really know? Well, I'll tell you. You see, there is a loop or circuit in which we go through as human beings. We are born into this human experience, into this world. We take on this flesh and matter that becomes our clothing. And at some point, we discard that clothing to essentially return to the form and shape and state in which we were before we took on this clothing. And so in this circuit, or in this circle of life, if you will, we, in fact, are really spiritual beings, spiritual energies, spiritual forces, if you will, that simply take on this clothing. Imagine it also as a vehicle. We get into this car, we drive it. When the car cannot be driven anymore, we leave the car and assume another one after some waiting period, or almost immediately in some cases. So, let me share with you some background. For my Khan folks, this is their anchoring point or perspective. You may recall that I've spoken to you before about how we enter this world, and once we enter this world, what kind of parts make up the whole human being. For the Akan peoples, my folks from Ghana, West Africa, we view the coming into this human world, coming into human experience on this or another planet as a negotiation between us, our spiritual form, in terms of being just pure energy, and the creative force that animates the entire cosmos. And in that conversation, there's negotiation. Now, there are two sort of destinies that are laid out. And in a subsequent episode, I'll talk more about destiny, reincarnation, soul, and those kinds of matters. For now, there is a commanded destiny referred to as the Inkrabia, meaning to depart, or sort of a message you have when you depart or leave a place. Then there's a Shibia, and Shibia is the fixed destiny, meaning it is the particular purpose that one is commanded with. And so, the conversation goes something like this. This creative force will say to you or I, while we're in our mother's womb, getting ready for our human experience, taking on human form, our organs, our flesh, everything that we need to have a human experience. In that process, there is a commanded destiny that says from this creative force, right, which includes all the forces in the universe, including ancestral forces, say that you will do this and this during your human experience. That is the Shibia, the commanded destiny or purpose. Then there's the Inkrabia, that is before you leave, before you depart, you may say, well, I will do that, but I also want to do this. There are particulars that you may want to accomplish while you're in your human form. And so the combined destiny or purpose is really one that's negotiated between the Shibia and the Inkrabia. That is, what you desire and what the ancestral and spiritual forces of the universe and cosmos desire. And so it is a combination of the two. And therefore, if one wants to alter or change or otherwise get rid of their destiny, oftentimes my folks will say to those persons proverbially that it was you who chose that destiny, so you can't blame anyone else for your choices. Now, that places a burden or responsibility on the head of those of us like me who come into this human world with this combined destinies, right? The commanded destiny and the personal destiny that is fused together or tightly braided together. And from this, we are supposed to live out the two. Now, we don't do this alone because we're born in a family and through the family. And so through the family and the community that we're born into, they are supposed to safeguard, protect, but also help to what? Grow and groom both of those destinies that are tightly bound together. In the course of a lifetime, we are supposed to accomplish the benchmarks that are associated with those destinies. Now, depending upon how close or how far we are near or stray away from those destinies, that will determine what happens to when we reach our temporal life in our car or our human clothing. That is our bodies, right? And so when it's time for our bodies to be removed as clothing or to be essentially disposed as a used car, then at that point, this is what happens to the parts of the being. For my folks, the physical body, our physiology, is the manifestation of moja or blood. And we get our blood from our mother's lineage. And so that moja or blood essentially returns to the earth, which we call asasiya. That is the motherly, nurturing earth, the spirit thereof that appears on a Thursday. Our physiology, that is our blood plasma, our body parts, and our organs, they all return to the earth. But we have other parts. We also have the sunsum, which is the spiritual personality. That goes back to the world of spirit, but in this form. It assumes the form of osumain, or ancestor. Then there's the okra, and the okra is the soul. And the soul goes back to the creative force of the cosmos. Essentially, it melts back into energy, essentially melts into energy. The same way that maybe a cup of water is poured into a larger basin of water. The physical corpse is buried, right, into the earth, right? And that, of course, is the densification of the moja. But the moja is joined by the semen from the father that fertilize the egg from the mother. And that semen, of course, forms the physical corpus of the physical body that we inhabit throughout a lifetime. Again, those are put into the earth to fertilize the earth, as it were. These parts of the human being, they have their own, essentially, ways in which they metastasize into the earth and into the cosmos. What's important here for us is that since there are 4 categories of ancestry, this is how those categories take shape. Depending upon how near or far we stay with our commanded and our personal destinies will determine which bucket or which category we fall into. And that will determine where you go. Essentially, do you visit the land of ancestors or do you not? And so, in short, for those who have lived a righteous, honorable life, they are counted among the Sumain Pa, or those that are the auspicious ancestors. They are the ones who can help us on the spiritual side of things while we live out our life in the mundane. Those are the ones we call on doing libation and ritual and other kinds of ceremonial acts. Then you have the Nananom Simamfu. These are the evolved or mature ancestors. They not only lived out their purpose, they did so with what we call Subain Chini, which is this upright character and spirit and soul. They are the ones who are formed what you call the bigger heads. They are the ones who are a category above this Sumain Pa. There are layers to this. Now, there's the other 2 categories. One category for those of us who died a violent death. Murder, stabbing, car accident, violent death. Which means those ones are not counted among the Sumain Pa and the Nanam Simamfu. These are people who are often disbarred from going to what we call Asamando, essentially where the ancestors dwell. And they're disbarred because essentially they have to try and do it over again. In many cases, they'll live a life or renewed life leading to the same end. What changes? There has to be some intervention by either folks on the spiritual side or those on the mundane, temporal human side that are working in concert with the spiritual forces for intervention. Otherwise, they'll continue in that loop, in that circuit of leading a life that leads to the same end. Now, what happens to them and the others? They stay close to the earth. They stay close to the family and community in which they hailed from. That is, you see them, for example, in the corner of houses. You see them around in the compound or around the living quarters. They won't stray that far because they're in this indeterminate position. No, it's not purgatory, and no, it's not hell, because those concepts don't exist among my folks. They're simply closer to the earth as a spirits without a home. Think of it as spiritual homelessness. Now, the land of the ancestors looks like this. I've traveled there a few times. Their houses, sometimes they are vacated. In fact, on one trip there was no one in the houses. And it was in the evening. It looked like an evening time, around somewhere around what would be 6 p.m. our time. Now, their time as we know it don't exist. Flesh and bones, we know it don't exist. Oxygen doesn't exist. All the rules that we're accustomed to do not exist. The houses don't have rules because these ancestral spirits, they come and go. You see, they don't fall asleep forever. They work. And they're organized into duties and roles. And so you will find cadres of ancestors plucked from the Sumaimpa and from the Ananum Samanfo, that is the evolved, mature ancestors, our auspicious ancestors. And they're the ones who work on our behalf. And all they do is work. They don't rest. Because exhaustion and pain, they don't feel because they don't have human bodies. They just work, and they work all the time. Do they get tired? Yes, they do. Because energy has limits. But they work and they work. But they're organized into duties. Some deal with deciphering symbols. Some deal with rituals. Some deal with giving you foresight or insight into what's going to happen down the road. They're organized into duties and roles to work on our behalf. But, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are layers and levels to this. So among the ancestral spirits, there are also other spiritual forces that are in fact higher than them. And guess what? Because ancestors don't die, they just multiply. There are those who came before our most recent ancestors. And so there's some that are, in our mundane terminology, are thousands, if not millions of years old. And those I refer to as the bigger heads, meaning they have a lot more authority and powers over the other ones that have come later. And so there's a hierarchy. Surprisingly, their world is similar to ours. There's a hierarchy of being. There's a hierarchy of power and authority. There are houses, there are abodes, there are streets. But the way they work and move is unlike here because they are inhibited by the rules, what we refer to as physics. They're uninhibited by the rules of matter. So they can go and come as they please. They can travel as they please. One moment they can be in this country, next moment they can be in another country. But they're always working and always working on behalf. And so, for instance, when we call on them, they may not be available. It's not because they don't hear us, because they're working and they travel. For instance, my grandfather would say that, I'm not available right now, but I'll come back later. Because he's working and he traveled. Because there's a hierarchy among them, they have to work within that setting. And so there are times when my grandfather would say to me that I'll take your message to them, meaning the bigger heads. And among the bigger heads, that is the more mature or more ancient of the ancestor spirits, there are other spiritual forces that are located in nature, located in cosmos, that have even more authority that one has to go through. And yes, they do work together, meaning ancestral forces do work with spiritual forces because they're all unencumbered by the physical human form that bounds us to the rules of this earth. So it's a fascinating world, but it's also a world in which even when I travel there, I can't stay long. And they'll tell me this, because if I stay there long, it means I can't return back to this human world. And eventually my human body will pass away. And it's a fascinating world. And it's a world that I will give you some of the tools to travel there, but make sure you come back. And when you do, check out another episode. I'm Kwesi Kunadu for Powered by Ancestry. Thank you for joining us. As usual, put your comments and ideas for other episodes in the comment section, your questions in the comment section. Look forward to seeing another episode. Thank you for joining us. Stay well.